Okay, so you want to own a whaling ship. You already know the picture. A three-masted ship leaning into a gray ocean. The lookout screams, "There she blows," and small boats drop into the water. 6 men rowing straight at the biggest animal on Earth, with a hand-thrown harpoon. Danger, glory, and a fortune in oil swimming away in front of you. One number ruins the picture. When the New Bedford whaler Benjamin Tucker came home in 1851, her cargo sold for a net profit of $45,000, a staggering sum. And of that, the men who actually rowed at the whales, who threw the harpoons, who died doing it, split a thin slice of about 30% between 50 of them. One ordinary seaman on a voyage of the ship Milton earned, for years of work, $10.10. So the question that decides whether you get rich isn't how many whales you can catch. It's who signs the contract before the ship ever leaves the harbor. Get that wrong and you'll do the most dangerous work in America for the price of a good pair of boots. The harpoon was never the business. The lay was. And nobody teaches you what a lay is. You can go through 12 years of school, learn nothing about the single cleverest labor contract in American history, one that Silicon Valley quietly reinvented 150 years later and called stock options. So let's build one whaling voyage from scratch, using the real pay records of real ships, and follow every dollar from the harbor to the horizon and back. And these are not vague numbers from a textbook. We have the actual contracts. We know, for instance, that in 1841, a broke young man named Herman Melville signed on to the New Bedford whaler Acushnet for a lay of 175th of whatever she earned. He would turn that voyage into Moby Dick. But on the shipping paper, he was just another green hand promised a 175th slice of a profit that might never come. The paperwork survives. The man who wrote the greatest novel about whaling was, financially, at the very bottom of the ledger we're about to build. Because by the end, you'll see that a whaling ship was never really a hunt. It was a venture capital fund that happened to float. And you'll make 3 decisions that decide whether you come home rich or come home owing money for the privilege of nearly dying. Start with the contract, because the contract is the whole invention. A whaleman was not paid a wage. Not $1 a day, not $1 a month. He was paid a lay, a fraction of whatever the voyage earned, handed over only after the ship came home. 2, 3, sometimes 4 years later. And the way that fraction was written down tells you everything about who this business was built to reward. The lay was written as its reciprocal. A lay of 1/20th meant you got 1/20th of the net proceeds. A lay of 1/35th meant 1/350th. Lower number, bigger share. And the spread between the top and the bottom is the most important fact in this entire business. Look at the real papers from the ship Milton, returning in 1836. The captain's lay was 1/17th, $5,882. The first mate, 1 hanny second. The harpooneer, the boat steerer, the man who actually put the iron in the whale, 1/75th, about $1,300. The blacksmith, 140th. And the green hand, the first timer, could be written in as low as 1/350th. Now hold the captain's number next to the crewman's, because this is the reframe. On that same ship, in that same year, off the same whales, the best paid man earned $800, and the worst paid earned $571. And on another Milton voyage, an ordinary seaman's lay came out to $10.10. For years of labor. That is not a wage system. That is an equity cap table. And you, the owner, sit above all of it. So here is the first thing to understand before you spend a penny. Whaling did not pay for work. It paid for shares. And the man who owned the most shares while doing none of the rowing was the man who got rich. The Nantucket Historical Association says it plainly. The lay system was, in their words, remarkably similar to the stock options that modern startup employees are paid with, and the whaling agents functioned like the general partners of a venture fund. You are about to become a general partner. Let's raise the fund. And consider what these 50 men were actually being sent to do for their fractions. When a whale was sighted, they did not fire on it from the safety of the ship. They lowered small open rowing boats and chased the largest predator on the planet by hand, rowing close enough to drive in a harpoon by arm. Then the wounded whale would run, towing the little boat behind it at terrifying speed across open water, a ride the men grimly called the Nantucket Sleigh Ride. Sometimes the whale dived and the line had to be cut or it would drag the boat under. Sometimes it turned and smashed the boat to splinters. This was the daily work priced into a 1/350th lay. The green hand was not paid almost nothing because his job was easy. He was paid almost nothing because the contract was written by the people who stayed on shore. First cost, the ship and her outfit, and this is where most people guess wrong in both directions. A whale ship herself was often old on purpose. You did not want a beautiful new vessel rotting in the tropics for 4 years. What cost the money was the outfit. The whaleboats, the harpoons and lances, the casks, the food for 50 men for years, the trade goods. And one thing that should not exist on a wooden ship at all, the tryworks. This was a brick furnace, built directly onto the deck, where the crew boiled strips of blubber down into oil in the middle of the ocean. Stop and picture the insanity of it. You have built an open fire on a wooden vessel hundreds of miles from land, and you are feeding it around the clock. The alternative was worse. Without the tryworks, you'd have to sail home before the blubber rotted, turning a 3-year fortune into a 3-week loss. So the furnace was not optional. The whole business model depended on carrying a controlled fire across an ocean of the one thing fire destroys. It was, quite literally, a floating factory that could burn to the waterline, and sometimes did. The whaleman's shipping list recorded that in the late 1850s, New Bedford whalers went to sea at an average expense with outfits of about $30,500 each. Per man, roughly $1,000 laid out before the ship cleared the harbor. $30,000 gone on a voyage that will not return a single cent for 2 to 4 years, if it returns at all. And many did not. Ships were stove in by whales, crushed in Arctic ice, lost with all hands. So here's your first decision, and every real agent faced it. You have $30,000 to put to sea. Do you put all of it into one ship and pray she comes home greasy? Or do you take a 1/8 share in 8 different ships, so that the one disaster doesn't ruin you, but no single triumph makes you truly rich either? Hold your answer, because how the real fortunes were built is going to surprise you, and it wasn't by owning ships at all. Now, who pays for all this? Not usually one rich man. This is the second piece of the invention. Whaling capital was pooled. An agent, the man at the center of it all, would raise money from merchants, widows, retired captains, shopkeepers, and split the ownership of a single voyage into fractional shares, sometimes 60/4ths, spread across a dozen or more investors. The agent took a cut for organizing it, ran the voyage, chose the captain, sold the oil, and distributed the returns. The Nantucket Historical Association's own phrase for this is a venture capital ecosystem. Agents raised and allocated capital exactly like the general partners of a fund, and successful captains, after a greasy voyage, would put their winnings back in as investors in other men's ships, in precisely the way a founder today cashes out and becomes an angel investor. Read that again, because it collapses 150 years. In 1840, in a Quaker port in Massachusetts, they had already built the limited partnership, the diversified fund, carried interest, and the founder-turned-investor pipeline. They just measured returns in barrels of oil instead of dollars per share. And the parallel goes deeper than the shares. A modern venture fund knows most of its investments will fail, 1 or 2 will pay for everything, and the fund survives only by owning small pieces of many bets. That is exactly the logic that ran New Bedford. No sane agent put his whole fortune into one hull, because he knew, from the crew lists and the wrecks and the clean voyages, that a predictable fraction of ships would simply never return. The lay system on board and the fractional ownership on shore were the same idea pointed in 2 directions. Spread the risk so widely that no single catastrophe, at sea or in the counting house, could sink the man at the top. The owners took the top. The standard owner's share of a voyage's profit was 60 to 70%. On the Benjamin Tucker's $45,000 profit, the owners kept the lion's share and left between roughly $13,000 and $18,000 to be divided among the captain and all 50 crew. For years of work, split 50 ways, minus deductions we haven't even reached yet. Which brings us to the ruling number of this entire business. It is not the price of oil, and it is not the cost of the ship. It is the size of your lay versus the length of your debt. Because here is the part the sea shanties leave out. The crewman didn't just receive a small share. He often received it minus everything the ship had advanced him. To get a man aboard, agents paid a cash advance up front, around $75 in the mid-1800s. Then, during the voyage, every item he needed came from the ship's store, the slop chest, tobacco, boots, a coat, medicine, and every item was charged against his future lay, at the owner's prices, with interest. The New Bedford Whaling Museum states it flatly. A crewman might end a voyage owing the owner's money, earning, in their words, less than nothing. 2 years of the most dangerous work on Earth, and you step off the ship in debt to the man who sent you. And that's not a tragic accident. It was the model. The largest whaling firm in the country. J. And W.R. Wing made its fortune, this is documented, primarily from outfitting the seamen. They ran a dry goods store, indebted the sailor for his clothing and boarding before he sailed, charged substantial interest, and collected it out of his lay when he returned. The oil was almost the side business. The debt was the business. So understand what you actually own as the agent. You own the ship, yes. But more importantly, you own the store the crew must buy from, the advance they must repay, and the interest on both. You make money whether the voyage is greasy or dry, because the crewman's debt comes due either way. His lay can go to zero. Your interest does not. The expensive part was never the ship. The expensive part is being the man who has to row. Now, staff the fund. Because a whale ship, like the saloon and the counting house, had a strange and revealing org chart. At the top, on paper, the captain. But remember, on land, above him sits you and your investors. The captain got the largest lay, around an eighth. But he was your employee, your fund manager at sea. Below him, the mates. Then the specialists whose skill actually determined whether you came home rich. The boat steerers, the harpooneers, on a 1/75th lay. Because a man who could reliably strike a whale was worth 10 who could only row. Then the tradesmen, the blacksmith mending irons, the cooper building the very casks your fortune would be stored in, the carpenter, and at the very bottom, the green hands on a 1/350th lay, the raw labor, the most expendable men aboard. And here's the detail that tells you what kind of business this really was. Whaling crews, from very early, were among the most racially mixed workforces in America. Black sailors, Cape Verdeans, Azorians, Pacific Islanders, Gay-head Wampanoag from Martha's Vineyard, all aboard the same ship. Not out of idealism, out of arithmetic. The lay didn't care what color your hands were. It paid a share for a job, and a boat steerer's share was a boat steerer's share. In a country that in 1840 still held millions in slavery, the whale ship was one of the only places a black man could be paid the same lay as a white man for the same rank. The contract was so purely financial that it was, almost by accident, colorblind, because prejudice was less profitable than a full boat. That is what a lay does. It turns every man aboard, from the captain to the cook, into a small shareholder whose only incentive is oil in the hold. The genius of the system is that it aligned 50 desperate men toward one number, without paying any of them until it was safe to pay. So where does the money actually come from? Follow the whale. You are hunting, mostly, the sperm whale, and you are hunting it for 3 products. First, whale oil, boiled out of blubber in the try-works, sold to light the lamps and grease the machines of the Industrial Revolution. Second, and far more valuable, spermaceti, the fine waxy oil from the head of the sperm whale, which made the brightest, cleanest candles in the world. And third, baleen, the flexible whalebone from the mouths of other whales, the plastic of the 19th century, bent into corset stays, buggy whips, umbrella ribs, and understand what that oil actually was, because it explains the whole fortune. Before whale oil, night was dark. A clean-burning sperm oil lamp or a spermaceti candle was, for much of the 19th century, the best artificial light on Earth, and every lighthouse, every drawing room, every factory that wanted to run after sunset needed it. You were not selling a luxury. You were selling the light itself. And the machines of the early Industrial Revolution ran on the grease that came out of the same animal. That is why the demand looked bottomless, and why so many men bet their lives on it staying that way. The Benjamin Tucker's cargo in 1851 tells you the mix. Over 73,000 gallons of whale oil, over 5,000 gallons of the premium sperm oil, and 30,000 pounds of whalebone. Net profit, $45,000. At a time when New Bedford, on the strength of exactly this, became the richest city per capita in the entire United States. But here is your second decision, and it is the one the smart agents agonized over. Whale oil was going up in value as whales got scarcer and harder to find. But every year, the voyages got longer and more expensive, and a new thing was appearing in the ground in Pennsylvania called petroleum. Do you keep sending ships on 4-year voyages to the far Pacific, betting the price of oil stays high? Or do you start pulling your capital out of whaling while the industry still looks unstoppable? Keep that question open, because the men who answered it wrong are a warning, and the men who answered it right are the whole point. Now, run the 2 voyages every owner eventually lived. The Greasy voyage first. Your ship is gone 3 years and comes home full. A greasy voyage, in the language of the trade. Say she nets $45,000, like the Benjamin Tucker. You and your investors take your 60 to 70% off the top. call it $30,000, split among the men who never left port, in proportion to the fractions they bought. The captain takes his fat lay and may reinvest it in your next ship. And the crew divides their thin remainder 50 ways, minus their advances, minus the slop chest, minus interest. You have turned a $30,000 outfit into a fortune, and you did it without ever seeing a whale. In a year like that, a whaling agent could out-earn any merchant, any banker, any manufacturer in New England. That is why New Bedford's mansions still stand today. Then the dry voyage. And notice how many separate ways it can go wrong, each of them fatal on its own. The ship comes home clean, barely any oil, after 3 years, and there is almost nothing to divide. But the outfit still costs $30,000, or the ship is stove by a whale and simply never comes home. This was not a sailor's myth. In 1820, the Nantucket whale ship Essex was rammed head-on by an enraged sperm whale and sank in the open Pacific. The true event that would later give Melville the ending of Moby Dick. Her crew drifted for months in the whaleboats, and the survivors lived only by eating the men who didn't. 30 years later, in 1851, the Anne Alexander was stove and sunk the same way. To you, the owner, sitting safe in New Bedford, each of these is the same line in a ledger. $30,000 of outfit and a ship, gone, and nothing coming back but the news. Or she is crushed in the Arctic ice. Or she comes home greasy in 1859, just as petroleum from Pennsylvania begins to collapse the price of whale oil, and your magnificent cargo sells for a fraction of what it would have fetched a decade earlier. And here is the cruelty of the model for you, the owner, on that dry voyage. Your losses are capped by your fractions. You owned an eighth of 8 ships, so one disaster is a wound, not a death. But if you owned all of one ship, one bad voyage takes everything. The whole invention, the fractional shares, the pooled capital, the agent spreading risk across a dozen investors, existed for exactly this moment. It wasn't generosity. It was the industry discovering, a century before Wall Street formalized it, that the way to survive a business where 1 in 20 ventures is a total loss is to own a slice of 20 of them. So which men actually got rich? The museum's own verdict is blunt. Few individuals got rich whaling, and most of those who did were the owners and the agents. Not the harpooneers, not the captains mostly. The men on land who owned the shares and the store. Which brings you to your third decision, the hardest, because it comes disguised as a triumph. It is the 1850s. You are rich. Your ships are greasy. Whale oil has never been more valuable, and New Bedford is the wealthiest city per capita in America. Everyone around you is doubling down, building bigger ships, sending them on longer voyages to chase the last whales into the Arctic. And you have read the same newspapers they have. You know whales are getting scarcer. The voyages that used to take 2 years now take 4. You know they've struck petroleum in Pennsylvania in 1859, and that it makes a lamp oil that doesn't require sailing halfway around the world and killing the largest animal on Earth. So, do you take your fortune and get out now, pull your capital, put it into railroads or textile mills or New Bedford real estate, while whaling still looks like the future? Or do you reinvest in one more greasy voyage, because the money has never been better, and the men who quit early always look like fools right up until they look like geniuses? There is no arithmetic that answers it cleanly, because the number you'd need is when, exactly, the bottom falls out. And nobody ringing that bell knew either. But history kept the score. The whaling fortunes that survived became the banks, the mills, and the manufacturing of New England. The capital sailed off the ships and into the Industrial Revolution. The fortunes that stayed at the table went to the bottom of the Arctic with the ships nobody would insure. The last whaler left New Bedford in 1927, limping home against the wind, an ignominious end to what had been the largest whaling fleet on Earth. So here is the whole business, in 4 numbers. Cost to open the doors, about $30,000 to outfit one voyage, $1,000 a man, spent years before a single cent comes back, on a venture that might return nothing at all. The number that rules it, the lay against the debt. The owner takes 60 to 70% off the top before anyone else is paid. The green hand takes 1/30/50th, minus his advance, minus the slop chest, minus interest, and can step ashore owing you money, where the money actually is, not the harpoon. The oil paid, but the surest fortune was made outfitting and indebting the men who threw it. The largest firm in the country got rich on the store, not the sea. Survival odds, not the cruise, and barely yours. Few got rich. Most who did never rode. And the whole enterprise was a bet on whale oil that petroleum ended in a single generation. So if you do raise that fund and send that ship, remember what you actually bought. You didn't buy a hunt. You bought a venture fund with a furnace on the deck. 50 men turned into shareholders who couldn't be paid until it was safe, financed by a store they couldn't refuse, floating on a bet that the whales and the price of their oil would both outlast your patience. Get it right, and you build a mansion that still stands in New Bedford today. Get it wrong, and you're a name in a crew list. $10.10 for 2 years of your life, owing the store the difference. And if the idea that the real business was the contract and not the whale just landed for you, that a whale ship was a venture capital fund 150 years before Silicon Valley claimed the invention, then you already understand the thread this whole channel pulls. The same idea explains businesses 400 years apart. Subscribe, and you'll get the next one.